Okay.
So, for our first conversation, I gave you a big list of topics, and you decided on the H.P. Lovecraft and racism.
Yes.
So,
Actually, let's start with welcoming people to what may be a new internet show.
I mean, we could. Okay, okay. So, the idea is that James is not very smart and says things are stupid. So, it'd be a good idea to have a show where I correct him in his views, and everybody can watch because you um, we're educating James basically.
Is that what we should call the show? Educating James? That'll be like Educating James, episode 1, 2, blah, blah, blah.
It sounds like a BBC series where you slowly find out that one of the teachers that everyone loves is going to be fired because he's gay. Like Educating James, season 12. I'm worried about James. Yeah. So we're gonna pick some topics that we have views on. We don't know how far apart our views are in many cases, and we're gonna talk about them on the videos here.
Well, Lovecraft, he was the one that popularized the idea of the weird. He didn't invent it, but he popularized it, I think. Supernatural horror in literature, and he was talking about weird fiction. And
Okay, but like supernatural horror is certainly almost all horror up to that point. Like,
but the essay "Supernatural Horror in Literature" basically talks about that and what the difference is between traditional horror and gothic horror, and what he called weird fiction.
For the people at home, to sum it up, what's the difference?
Basically, the difference is that weird fiction deals with like forces from the outside. Well, this ties more into Lovecraft's own cosmicism.
Well, I mean, if you just want to get technical, a big part of his work was the tying of science fiction ideas to supernatural ideas plus horror. So, like, the way a lot of his stories seem is like in the beginning, you seem to be dealing with a supernatural, magical force. And then as you come to understand it, it's actually just something that's from space or another dimension or something that's just absolutely incomprehensible. So for me, the big thing about Lovecraft, what he introduced that was different was partially because of that, it was very psychological. Like, he could spend pages just inside a character's head describing this sort of fever dream of confusion or mental intrusion that you wouldn't get from, in Dracula or something.
Right. Well, my takeaway from Lovecraft is really focusing is the cosmicism. Is that human beings are really an unimportant part of the overall cosmos. The universe doesn't care about you. And there are things out there that are beyond human understanding.
Yeah, I think an important part of that is like the devil and Dracula are deeply involved with morality. Like, they care what people do, right? Like, they want your soul. They want to, they care about your right and wrong. And then horror can emerge from that. Or like a ghost exists because this family did something horrible. Whereas Lovecraft's creatures just are apathetic to your existence. And that's the scary part. It's not that you're being judged. It's that you're not even being noticed. So that's the thing. Yeah.
That's the thing. That's the part of Lovecraft that I think is the important takeaway. It's not the monsters. It's not, everyone goes insane. It's that sense of it's a scary, hostile universe out there. And I think that mixes well with the traditional Dungeons and Dragons dungeon crawl or hex crawl, in that here's the environment and it shouldn't care about you. You're going to go in and interact with it, but it is what it is. And I think it's more of the more of the old school way of doing things, like
crawling around in a lost civilization. You're interact like when Indiana Jones goes into the temple, not the Temple of Doom, the one at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's springing a bunch of traps which are meant to keep people from stealing an idol from a tribe that no longer exists. So he's sort of interacting with something that has an amoral relationship to him. Like the tribe doesn't exist. You know, the civilization that did that, released that boulder, is gone. Like, but from the point of view of the people setting loose the boulder, it's just, this is a mechanical thing that's happening. And he's interacting with a dead thing that is almost a natural process. It's just going to happen. And like Alien, the movie and the series, the alien isn't punishing you, right? Like it's not like you don't have to look to your sins. You just have to get out of the way of the alien.
Or it's like, or to put it another way, Jaws. The shark doesn't care about the people.
Right.
In Jaws 4, it's personal, and so that's
and suddenly it's no longer an old school dungeon crawl, right? Yeah. So we were going to talk about Lovecraft and racism. So let's just start. The dude was racist. Like, yes. I know that like every single thing that's attached to old school games, there's a guy who is doing a postdoc dissertation in history where they're reading the letters of everyone. Like, there's a guy who's read all of R.E. Howard's letters, and there's a guy who's read all of Tolkien's letters, you know, and they all have like a really complicated view of anything that, you know, you might say in a YouTube video. But like, the dude was fucking racist. Maybe he was less racist on a Tuesday or for 3 years after World War II. But basically, like, his cat was called the N-word. And that was clearly part of his worldview. I also think
although isn't that curious though, that obviously I wouldn't say that Lovecraft was a fan of black people, but he did like cats. And so he named
that's supposed to be.
Well, it's supposed to mean that he named this his companion that he was fond of after after a slur against people he didn't like, and that's weird to me.
It is creepy. There's something really insular about the specific kind of, because he was afraid of Norwegians and Swedes. Like, if you read his letters, he's like, he goes to the city in New York, and he's people walking around the street who weren't H.P. Lovecraft just freaked him out. And I think that his specific brand of racism was nerdiness, like apex nerdiness. Like, there was something for me about, and this gets into the writing, and I think it's what makes his parts of it are related to what makes it interesting, and parts of it are, you just hit a cliff with it. But he was an insular person who wanted to keep away from the grossness of life. Like, there's a reason that body horror came out of Lovecraft eventually, is because like the Gothic is a fear of death. You have this interesting character and they're in love and they're the narrator, and then we're worried they'll be gone. Like, oh no, what if so-and-so isn't here anymore? Like, that's the Gothic. Whereas Lovecraft is like a fear of life. Like, there's a thing and it's gross and it's breeding and it's living, and you might touch it and it's slimy and squamous and like, ew. And his racism was ew. Like, ew, other people. I think there's a certain, like, imagine your parents having sex. Like, I'm going to stop doing that right now, right? Like, you don't want to do that. Like, no one wants to do that. That's a kind of fear of life. It's like the icky, hairy stickiness of something too close, some other people in your space. That fear of life is very exaggerated in him. But it also means he can speak to it in a way that nobody else could. And exaggerated, it becomes not just racism, but this sort of like hatred of oh God, oh, more fucking people, oh, on the bus. You could just hear it. Like, he's just like, oh, I had to get on the bus and deal with a bunch of people who weren't university professors at all. And then someone took out their lunch and they unwrapped it and it was sticky and you could smell it. Like, it's almost like Taxi Driver. You know, like it's like maybe he's racist, but he's also like everything else. Like, and that, you know, Taxi Driver is a good movie because you can see from the sort of exaggerated ick factor.
Right. But he also didn't seem to like degenerate rednecks either. So I'm wondering if this was a misplaced class hatred.
I think part of it is class, but I also think, like, you know, like, can you imagine you're driving upstate in a car with Lovecraft because you know him, or he's going to go give a speech or whatever, and then you're like, hey, are you hungry? You want to stop? And there's like a little picnic table, and somebody's making some barbecue, or like, you know, like, I don't know, whatever they fucking make in New England, like, and they got some, and he's like, hell no, like, I'm not stopping by the side of the road and unwrapping something in butcher paper that some guy named Cletus made and eating. Like, fuck no, you know, like, there's a fastidiousness about him that, in the way it edits his fiction down to only what he's interested in, which is what a lot of really good writers can do, is like they take reality and they make reality consistent with only the stuff that's interesting. On the other hand, it is like everyone's life who's not interesting to him is sticky and ugly and gross and fleshy and might as well be from another planet, which is the nerdy.
And that shows up in the writing. The one big thing, the reason I wanted to talk about this, I did a blog post about this ages ago and gotten a couple of Google Plus back and forth, so it's been a while. The thing I want to challenge is the idea that Lovecraft was an extraordinary racist, even for his time. And I put forward that Lovecraft would be an ordinary racist even in our time.
I mean,
the thing that was unusual about Lovecraft is the way he expressed things, because that's a common criticism of his writing in general. Everything's so overblown and the adjectives and this and that. And he was like that describing other things. If you read his letters,
who gives a shit? Like, he was clearly racist. It is reflected in the work.
Yes.
I give a shit whether he's unusually racist or not. Like,
but that, you know, that's used as an argument about why you shouldn't read Lovecraft or like Lovecraft or use Lovecraftian influences. I see that argument.
I mean, I think a more powerful thing is just, you know, Jordan Peele produced Lovecraft Country, and Lovecraft Country exists. Like there's clearly like black writers and Jewish writers like myself. You know, he was anti-Semitic, even though his girlfriend or wife was Jewish. Clearly, like, Nope would not exist without Lovecraft. Like, it is literally like he says, you know, at the beginning of that movie, the guy goes, well, what's a bad miracle? The miracle is supernatural. You know, but then the thing turns out to be an alien, which is like, sorry, spoilers for Nope.
Yeah, I've not seen Nope or Lovecraft Country.
But the point is, like, the people who created those were black people who were interested in pulp. Lovecraft Country, in early scene, like one of the first scenes, the main character's dad walks into his garage and he's like, why do you like all this trash? He picks up like John Carter of Mars and he's like, what's this about? He's like, well, it's about a Confederate soldier who goes to Mars. You know, like, so right away they're talking about, like, this is a paperback collector, a sci-fi fan. Like, you know, he's interested in John Carter of Mars, but, you know, right away acknowledging, like, that's not a very sympathetic thing to be, you know. And I just think, like, nothing that a bunch of nerds on Google Plus say in 2014 about how racist or not racist Lovecraft was, or whether you should or shouldn't listen to him, is remotely as important as, like, what Jordan Peele has to say. There were definitely RPG world people who'd be like doing a lot of mental gymnastics to sort of excise Lovecraft from their mental world, but I think nothing they fucking say matters once you have talented creators of color weighing in and going, like, yeah, it's this but not that. You know, like, the guy who did Get Out has more moral authority than, but Innsmouth is like, oh, these people are so gross, they've interbred with fish people. And then you've got fish fuckers, and you've got Innsmouth. So do you think about the shadow of Lovecraft in that way with those books, or?
Well, certainly Fishfuckers, because that was directly inverting what Lovecraft did with Innsmouth. It's set in Innsmouth in England. Here's the original one, and the situation was reversed, so that's definitely on my mind. Dunsmouth, not so much, because it wasn't aping any of Lovecraft's stuff so directly. It was evoking the atmosphere, but it wasn't playing with Lovecraft's toys.
I guess I am wondering about, like, if you took seriously the argument for a while, it's like the aesthetic of Lovecraft, the aesthetic of like ick. Like his stories include Houellebecq in his book about Lovecraft is like saying a no to life. Like he talks about how many things are in everyday life that Lovecraft just consistently leaves out.
Yeah.
How do you make sure you don't become a fastidious misanthrope?
Well, when you find out, please let me know. It would be a direct.
So do you feel like you're in danger of becoming that guy?
Well, I've ranted about it enough on Facebook. Just every time.
I mean, not everybody who watches these videos is on your Facebook.
Right.
How sick you are. Think about humanity.
Every time I go out the door, I always come back in a worse mood, because just people in the grocery store, or I have to go across the bridge to the other side of the shopping center to go to the post office. Everybody's in the way. Nobody knows how to walk. It's just the people turn into like an obstacle course. How do I get from point A to point B? And sometimes I count how many assholes just cut right in front of me and block my way. And I count, oh, that's number 5, and that's number 6. And I'm wondering, is there some magic number where I snap? And it's like, oh, I just want to go from here to there and work stuff, post office. And I'm just, I remember thinking, 2020, like when COVID was supposed to be dying down and everything was still so crowded. And I was like, well, the pandemic obviously wasn't bad enough. Well, the something in my brain is just the impatience, is that these people are in my way. So I understand the ick of other people, of like, what is wrong with all these people? Why don't they just behave like me, and everybody would be able to walk orderly and nobody would be in each other's way? And that's not exactly the Lovecraftian sort of ick, but I understand going out the door and being like, what is humanity even?
But okay, I mean, for me, what counteracts that usually is like, I live where I live on purpose. There are things I like about people. There's things I like about even like chaos and a certain amount of like just encountering things I didn't expect. Like if every time I went to the store, I never had an anecdote coming home, I would be disappointed. I'd be bored. I mean, I've lived in places like that where you're just, nothing ever happens. You never see anyone do anything. You never overhear a conversation. Because I remember a lot of the essay I wrote, like Lovecraft Nerds and the Uses of Ick, that like clicked into place for me was I was looking at Nightmare Discourse about Kingdom Death. And it was like, the usual gang of suspects at Something Awful were like, Kingdom Death, it's grotesque, it's horrible. Why would anyone want to play this? It has boobs in it.
Because it's horrible. And I do think the boobs are kind of out of place in it, but that's a taste thing. That's not a morality.
Place? Like, I don't know. Like, there's a giant plasmic monster with a hand for a tail and an ass for a mouth. Like, I don't know. Like, why not? But
there's cheesecake. To me, it's a clash. It's a style clash.
True Lovecraftian horror is when you want less boobs, I think, honestly. Like, you see a boob and you're like, I don't want to see that. That might be the ultimate level of, like, you need to get help about your Lovecraftian horror problem.
Well, I've been trying. I mean, the cover of Don't Fuck the Priest was supposed to be completely grotesque. It's got, like, Technicolor goop coming out of the vagina. It's supposed to take this what would otherwise be a beautiful woman and just making it like, I don't want to look at that. That was the idea anyway.
So, okay, so the Kingdom Death thing I was going to say. So they're having that conversation, and one of the people on there, and this happens a lot, one of them will, and it's usually someone with a new account, will say, I don't know, like, this isn't so bad. Like, like, it's a body horror game. Don't you guys like all like anime, like that's full of like, like the most disturbing body horror shit. And immediately, obviously everybody dogpiled them. But one of the arguments given was like, and one person said, and they said it in a tone that was to everyone else, like whenever someone wants to have a reasonable debate about some kind of gross shit, it's because they want to fulfill their fetish of having everyone talk about it. Like, in other words, like having the argument at all, discussing the grotesque thing, even touching it was an impure act.
Hmm.
And that slid into place for me as like the sort of missing piece. It was like, I'm not even going to engage this is kind of the Lovecraftian act that is still very much with us. Like that idea that certain ideas and ways of thinking are so not, because Lovecraft said, like, I'm a Puritan, and anyone who isn't a Puritan in their life is fucked up. He says something, but in their literature, you shouldn't be. And this is like almost the opposite in the sense of like, in words, because words now are public, right? All our words and conversations are part of a public discourse. It's like, don't talk about that. You might be infected by it. And that slid into place. It's like, this is a person who, if you ask them about Lovecraft, they'd be like, Lovecraft is fucking, I read that when I was 12. I don't like it anymore. And Lovecraft is racist. That's what they would say, right? But
Lovecraft
is very much the idea that certain ideas are so gross, so unacceptable that you can't have conversations about their validity and or lack thereof, because Lovecraftian horror of the person who has the idea,
Yeah, but Lovecraft, all the stuff he was afraid of, all the stuff he didn't like, he put that in the work. I can't say it was a thorough exploration of his issues, but the things that he hated, he didn't like banish from his work.
No, yeah, I mean that
made them horror. The things that he didn't like, he made the antagonistic force, basically.
For me, when I talk about him, I'm talking about the things that are in his work and aren't in his aren't like in what made it unique rather than every detailed thing in it. And for me, what made him unique was the amount of time he could spend in the thought space. Like he could write a whole, like there's a story that he wrote with Barlow called The Night Ocean, where like almost nothing happens, and it's one of his best stories. Like this guy goes to New England, he's on the beach, he's alone in a cottage trying to write or do something. And for an hour and a half on the that's how long the audio version is, he's just disturbed by the beach and by people. There's not a real, there's a sort of, is this an incident? Did he see like maybe a weird hybrid creature? Hard to tell, but like, it's a great story in that like he somehow spends the whole time in this person's anxieties and fears. And I think that not a lot of writers could still, but especially before him, could do that. And it's also one of the reasons he's so hard to translate into RPGs, like, or in Shadow Out of Time. This guy who's worried about, he's not himself, like there's it eventually is aliens, but like it's his dreams and his worries that he's schizophrenic. And like, you spend so much time in the fear. And it's kind of, interesting that he managed to spend so much time in the fear without ever being like, hey, racism is dumb. Although he did change his views from what I understand in some ways. But that psychology and that willingness to examine at least his feelings or turn his feelings into an aspect of horror was what made those stories really different. I also think like maybe it was also the border on that was he did it with by not being interested in anyone else's personality. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like there's a certain first person thing. Like first person narrators don't have personalities. They're just describing how thoughts move in their head and like how they react to different. So he's describing objects. He's describing cities. He's describing atmospheres. He's never describing like this cab driver was this kind, like acted this way. Like he wasn't like, oh, he had a funny, quirky personality. He does not give a shit. He can't even describe the personality of his narrator. Like he's like, I'm this person, I'm that person. No, he's just like saying more first person, almost like last chapter of Ulysses, first person. Like there's something personalityless about everyone because he's too busy being creeped out. He's like maybe a person droning on and on in therapy about themselves and not having anything to say about anyone else. But he's kind of really good at it because he expresses all the terror, that involves.
The way you describe it, it's like, okay, let's see if I can. The idea that the Lovecraftian protagonist is like the player character of a role-playing game, that the character itself is just an empty vessel. It's just you view what's happening through them, and that's their function.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that the problem is like, I mean, we should probably talk about games a little bit, but like turning that into a party dynamic is very hard because a party of players in a game, a party is always fun. Like 4 people who like each other enough to play a game together are the center of gravity of players is always toward jokes. And I always think the center of gravity of the text should always be in the opposite direction. It should be super po-faced in a certain level because, I mean, not without a sense of humor in the writing, but like there's a reason that everybody likes Tolkien. There's such a seriousness there, and that's how you get a compromise in the middle where you have an ongoing story that the text takes it seriously enough that you see a future, you see consequences, you see a reality to this world because the players are going to just disintegrate it with jokes. Right. So, like they're going. And so I think Lovecraft as 4 guys who are eating popcorn, trying to inhabit his world is almost more, it's one of the more difficult things about him. It's like, there's ways to do it, but if you genuinely walk away from a Call of Cthulhu game with a sense of like cosmic horror, you've really done something. Like if you walk away having had fun, that's a good day playing a game. But you walk away like with the Lovecraft feeling, that's hard.
Yeah, well, I know that he was a social person. With his friends, he was known as someone that was very social. The idea that he really was just a shut-in that didn't like anybody isn't true. I mean, he wrote way too many letters to be healthy. But
he also, he had a real like, oh, these are my people. Yeah. I can talk to you about my bizarre dream of an obsidian fortress and you don't fall asleep, that's definitely a nerdy thing as well. Like you have your people and those are, you insulate yourself using them. I mean, I don't want to get out over my skis on like knowing about his life because, I remember what I remember, but I think turning Lovecraft into a game requires his stories are fundamentally not game-like in a lot of ways, even though they have very compelling things and monsters.
Well, again, when you say turn Lovecraft into a game, that's where you get into the what is Lovecraft. You just throw some deep ones in there and it's Lovecraftian. I mean, that's the level that some people think that's all you need to do.
When basically what they did in the original Call of Cthulhu is they took the system they had for RuneQuest, changed the skills to be modern, and then just added the sanity mechanic. Yeah. And I think that Sandy Peterson going, each monster, just by looking at it, you might go insane and insanity, and then you go so insane you're out of the game, or you have to act insane the whole time. That was an insight that was dead on. You know, like that way of taking a character out of the game or changing the game was probably like a very good first step. You know, in a way that we probably don't recognize anymore because we're just so used to it being there. But the idea that like these are things you interact with and they do harm to you just by you acknowledging them is such a Lovecraftian idea that really took, you know. I think that helped.
I hate the sanity mechanic.
All right, let's go. Here we are.
And I had, it wasn't lunch, but I sat down at a table with a big group of game designer people, sat down with Sandy Peterson, and the whole time I was just like, don't start an argument. Don't start an argument. Don't start an argument. The problem I have is that the sanity loss happens as a natural result of gameplay if the rest of the world goes on as normal. Because even as a kid, you know, the way that you know the other kids would run D&D games, what everyone would do is, like, when the adventurers go to an inn to sleep for the night, they don't all get their own rooms. You know, they don't just go and sleep for the night and then everyone meets down in the lobby in the morning. Everyone, you know, it's like 6 or 7 people all going to get one room. Someone's going to be standing guard because they're expecting something is going to happen, that there's always a threat. And to me, that is already, you know, displaying what I would call depleted sanity, as far as you're not acting like a normal person. You cannot fit in with the normal world. You know, you have one adventure, and then if you try to go back to town and you start behaving like, oh, and this is here and this is there, and the farmer's just like, well, I still gotta plant my crops. Get the hell out of here.
Sure, but they're doing something that makes sense for their goals.
Yeah, but the sanity system, it takes you out of the game for understanding the world as it is. That's the thing that I disagree with. I mean, it's not.
So you're saying, okay, if you're in a Call of Cthulhu game, you see the mythos monster, and then you start losing sanity. Oh, also, yeah, you're right that it can, understanding it. There's a loop. There's a little bump in the mechanic where understanding the creature, understanding what you're looking at, makes you more insane. I think that might be
in like reading the magic books,
right?
More insane, and it like conflates finding out the world as it is with like trauma, like seeing dead bodies. Also,
well, I mean, we started the whole conversation by saying that the whole point of the cosmic horror was that you don't matter. So you're seeing how the world is, and you're finding out that the world is you can't, like, all these spells are eventually going to backfire. Like, you can't win. Finding out something that's true and you can't win doesn't seem like, it seems like it would affect your sanity, or it could, right?
Yeah, but it's like it's wanting to simulate, you know, the people that turn into drooling idiots in Lovecraft and end up in the asylum.
Right.
But even the dude from a Thing on the Doorstep, everything he did made perfect sense if you knew what was really happening. The dude wasn't nuts.
But that's not, like, there. I think, you know, he acknowledges the difference between characters who are being weird because they're dealing with a weird phenomenon. Like, every morning I do this because this is happening, and I'm sure I look insane to the denizens of this local New England town. That's one character. A completely different character is the one who sees the thing, doesn't develop a strategy to deal with it, and just goes fucking nuts. Like, those are different characters in Lovecraft.
Yeah, but the sanity mechanic treats it all like the same thing.
No, because the one who the one who's setting up the little, who's doing something has succeeded on his role, right? Like he's taking real action to protect himself from the thing, whereas the one who is babbling about rats in the walls and goes to the asylum is the one who failed his check.
Yeah, I mean, I still think like Ash from the Evil Dead series. Yeah, seeing how he was when in the beginning of the first movie when he's rolling up with his friends to the cabin, and then how he is by the end of Ash versus Evil Dead. I mean, to me, that's someone that has lost all of their freaking. Even at the beginning of the Ash versus the Evil Dead, it's like he can't live among normal people. He's living in a trailer. He's got a crappy, retail job, and this is a guy who is basically a loser in real life, but that's because of what he understands about the universe, and it's like he comes back alive when he's confronted with it again. So it's like the sanity mechanic would just have him be more disadvantaged when the stuff comes back, whereas I think he's already sanity 0, and so when
you're interpreting sanity as ability to get along in society, ability to seem normal.
Well, I'm taking the sanity label at face value.
Well, I mean, again, and that's not necessarily an accurate, not everybody's definition. Like you're saying, sanity is an ability to appear normal, and I've always thought of sanity as like an ability to take actions, and this is roughly what the actual, what an American educated shrink would tell you is the ability to take actions that are in line with your goals, and your goals roughly make sense. Like, so you could be completely alienated from the people around you, but you're still taking actions that are in line with real and understandable goals. And Picasso walking around, some town in Spain in a muumuu, drinking a pitcher full of fucking bright green Skittles. He doesn't fit in, but he's doing his job in the world, which is to be an eccentric artist, like that's not insane. That's just being different. Like those are Lovecraft characters. They're ones who's like, he describes it, honestly, the capacity to think exits people. That's different than like not getting along, or like not.
Right, but again, the way the sanity mechanic, it's like how many people in Lovecraft stories have read the Necronomicon? It's right there in the library of the university, and those people are all fine. There's no sign. People read that it's kept under lock and key, but all these academics, especially the Dunwich Horror, and especially the at the Mountains of Madness, it seems like everybody on that expedition's read the Necronomicon, back at Arkham University, and it's in this by the sanity mechanic in Call of Cthulhu. That's degrading your sanity just reading the magic books.
Sure, but I mean, if you've ever played, like, just because you lose a few, you start with like D100 points. So you lose 7, you're still,
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I think that's just it's playing up to a cliche of Lovecraft. That's not necessarily. It's like exaggerating something in Lovecraft for gameplay purposes, and it's like I understand it, but then at the same time, I'm the person that's like, no, Lovecraft isn't actually the actual things and entities, and so
Well, I mean, okay, when I did Demon City, I was unhappy with how long it took a character to go insane in Call of Cthulhu. Like, I was like, it takes a really long time, unless you're, just throwing mythos creatures at the characters left and right in a way that Lovecraft would generally not. Unless you're doing that, it takes several sessions to get the characters to the point where they're doing that. And I didn't like that. because it didn't reflect how, because Demon City is more about like horror movies in general, or horror in general. So I was like, people need to be able to freak out really quickly, after one or two stimuli, but also made it temporary. So the character loses sanity, they have a panic symptom, they start doing something that, a PC trying to win a game doesn't do, but a character in a movie might do. Like, they're just freaking out, they're not doing anything, they're they keep drinking water for no reason, or they run out of the cave, whatever. And then the next one, it resets more quickly. So what would you do if you were designing just a Lovecraftian game? Like, it's a Call of Cthulhu style game, like it's modern or it's the 20s or whatever, and you are just building a Lovecraft game, what goes in there?
You see, my instinct would be to bypass a sanity mechanic altogether. How many of the protagonists of a Lovecraft thing actually go dribbling nuts insane? What I would do is I would turn it into probably some sort of story mechanic where it affects your ability to interact with the actual human fake illusion world, the world that humanity's created for itself, ignoring what's actually out in the cosmos. So it would affect your ability to have connections and resources, because
So
you start
more
becoming
like H.P. Lovecraft.
You become more like H.P. Lovecraft. You become more like the Unabomber. It's like you see these patterns in the world, and of course, in the case of a Lovecraftian game, these things are real. There are really these monsters. There's really these influences. But you're going to become more and more like, I can't participate in the world because I know this exists. I can't just go out on a date or go to my 9-to-5 job, and it's impossible knowing how.
Will you be able to go to Finnish metal shows?
Yeah, metal shows. Yeah, that is, especially that show last night, definitely a sign of insanity. It was nuts. It was two bands really seemed like they were full of mentally ill people, and the middle one was just weird. Yeah, I think you end up. Yeah, I think that is the definition of being insane, as you go to these friggin' shows.
So you're saying, like, your vision of a Call of Cthulhu game is everyone slowly slides toward being you. You're in the basement with your webcam, surrounded by books and CDs you don't need, physical media you don't need, unable to interact with people except by going to metal shows.
I don't interact with anyone at the metal shows. I mean,
this is presented as an exciting thing to do with your Sunday afternoon with your friends.
Yeah. Well, that's the bad consequence. If things go wrong, you end up like me. Yeah, you end up publishing books of even weirder stuff.
So it's a complete circular loop. By engaging in the weird fiction, the worst outcome is creating more weird fiction.
Well, yes, that's how all creative things work. Is
the Iron Triangle.
They're all sanity destroying loops. The more you like something, the more they destroy your life. Well, that had a lot to do with Lovecraft's racism.
Well, I mean, is there something else you want to say?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, like, how it actually manifests in his work, and what that means for using those elements of the work when you're using the Lovecraftian toys or using Lovecraftian methods to build your role-playing stuff.
I mean, honestly, unless you try to, it doesn't come in.
Yes and no. For example, Shadow over Innsmouth. I mean, that whole thing is it could be just about fishmen. It could easily just be about fishmen, or it's all about race mixing.
Yeah, I think that Innsmouth is actually like one of the ones where you're definitely looking right at like.
You're looking right at it,
Right.
and it's one of the classics. That's what makes it complicated, because there's plenty of the lesser works where you can just like horror at Red Hook, you can just say, oh, fuck that one, and just ignore that one. But like Shadow over Innsmouth's like you can't. That's one of the major works, and it's right there.
I mean, I guess for me, Innsmouth was kind of the least interesting because it's like it doesn't have a lot of that like dream space stuff. That's the kind that, you know, what I like, you know? So I'm like, okay, he goes to a town and everybody's kind of gross. Like for me, it's almost like Coen Brothers horror.
But it's
You know, like in the Coen Brothers movies, you have these people that are like in No Country for Old Men, there's the guy with the store. He's like, well, are you going to do it or are you not going to do it? And the guy is funny. He's funny. He's sympathetic. He's sad, but he's also funny looking. And it's like, okay, that's an interesting character, you know? And like, it could be caricature. You could be making fun of him. You could be like putting his humanity and kind of eccentricity up against the sort of sinister aggression of like the Javier Bardem character. But like, that's just, he's a kind of a local yokel in this sort of, it could mean lots of things way. And for me, that the Dunsmuth story is just like, it's like it's just, so it's sort of one note, you know, it doesn't have that, it doesn't seem to get very far into anybody's head in a way that like I need to care about it. I don't know about you.
No, the story itself doesn't, but I think it leaves enough threads of world building. I think there's a reason that people keep coming back to it. There's enough seeds there to do interesting things that Lovecraft didn't do. And I think that's the most interesting thing about it, because you can easily start world building based on what's there and unexplored. I think a lot of the Lovecraft suppositions don't really work on a one-to-one level, because Lovecraft, as an atheist writing, well, at least no Judeo-Christianity, you know, God existing. You know, that's going to be jarring when most of the population is religious, and now it's more and more a secular society. And so the people that'll be reading Lovecraft are probably the people that aren't bothered by the idea that, oh, I'm just this biological accident on this rock hurtling through space around a giant nuclear reactor. You know?
Sure, but I think a lot of people, we haven't gone through that idea and come out with reasons to live on the other side in every case. You know, like I think just because people kind of basically accept atheism doesn't mean the horror of being completely uncared for has been metabolized. You know, I read somewhere that like troops in Afghanistan, American troops, you know, they have a library in the base, and the number one author checked out is Lovecraft.
Okay.
Like, now that could speak to race. It could be all. It could be racism. It could, but like, you're alone. Like, because I mean, you know, the life of an American soldier in one of those zones is often total boredom. Like nothing happens, and then one day of just apocalyptic, you don't even know what's going on, and then back to, you know, but like that feeling of isolation. Like I don't think people know what to do yet with being alone in the universe. You know, some people have managed, but it's a kind of, you figure it out yourself. It's like those players where you're like, it's a sandbox game, and you're like, well, what do you want to do? And everybody's like, I don't know. Like, they haven't yet figured out an XP system for an atheist world in a lot of cases.
Yeah, but I do think that's why a lot of the people working in the Lovecraft space, and I'm certainly not exempt from this, they turn up the things that Lovecraft left out or left undescribed. You know, the sexual elements that are underneath some of Lovecraft's stuff, you know, starts being pushed to the front. You know, the body horror and the gore that's involved. I mean, at the Mountains of Madness, the whole bunch of the research party are like dissected. vivisected, and that's mentioned but not lingered on by
I
Lovecraft.
think part of the thing about him, and maybe one of the reasons that makes as writing, right? You're talking about just not what the setup is, but as a series of sentences, is that almost like true gore body horror and then actual sex are like this sort of white hot sun center of the universe, and he's describing the heat rising as you get close to it, and the disintegration happens before you even get to it.
Yeah,
in a certain sense. So like the characters go nuts before they even contemplate, like before he's even like, I'm not going to show you. And that's the power of them. Because I think when he goes, if he went there, then he's not describing in Innsmouth like having sex with a frog person, right?
other authors have. I mean,
but other authors, that would be the climax of the story, so to speak, right? Like it would be like the aesthetic moment that I'm preparing you for is this gross out moment about body horror, sex, vivisection. And what his apex is he's making the mounting realization, fear, proximity, mind, imagination going wild of getting close to that into the climax, and that might be why it's such a rare effect. It's so much easier to make, like in Prometheus, like so many, like when you Google Prometheus, the alien movie, there's a lot of the results are Prometheus vivisection or self-surgery scene.
Yeah.
People are like, oh, that scene, I want to see that scene. There's a self-surgery scene, because that's the apex moment of gore. And like the version of Prometheus I really was hoping was going to happen was one where just freaking out by getting close to the creatures that created the human race or the alien or whatever, where that emotion was the apex, and you didn't even need the vivisection scene because you would like it's doing gore so well that it seems special is obviously a challenge. His whole thing was like the human mind goes nuts before it even gets there. I think David Lynch also managed to do that in Blue Velvet, where it's like there's not an apex gore moment in Blue Velvet or an apex sex moment in Blue Velvet. You're just watching the like sexual awakening of the characters as they get closer and closer to this thing, like how crazy everything gets, how like the gravity controls go off and the life support melts, and like there's something about that hysteria of getting close to the thing that, probably because he was a very fastidious, prudish, fearful person in a certain way, he's just so good at describing that.
Yeah, and one thing I do find interesting about Lovecraft's racism is he puts his anxiety over about the social situations he finds himself in, and the changes he's observing in the society that he doesn't like, and he puts them into the stories. And usually that's not his best stories, although I do want to tell this story because I think it's relevant and fun. What is it? In The Terrible Old Man, I think he has an Italian, Polish person, and Portuguese person, I think, like robbing this guy's house, and they come to a bad end. And Kenneth Haidt pointed out that those were the three, foreign, ethnic groups that were coming, that were most prominent in Providence at the time. Well, I find that funny because my maternal grandmother, she says her family goes back to the 1600s in the U.S., in America, and so they were here when the United States was formed, and so she's of that English blood that Lovecraft would have loved, and she married an immigrant from Poland. That was my grandfather, and they had a kid, my mother, who married someone from an Italian family. And it's just like, I am just this great Lovecraftian nightmare.
Like almost, I mean, anyone is. I mean, that's
I
the
know.
point, you know, is that like compared to the interesting things is like he could feel so much about it and think so little, but he clearly felt about it so strongly that he was able to write the feeling, which without having a single moment's like genuine thought, like maybe I should go talk to a Portuguese person. You know, like maybe I could, you know, not just buy a sandwich and talk about whatever someone else wants to talk about. But I think so the idea that he opens up a vista that he can't fully explore is interesting, because I was thinking about how, like, okay, if you take a vampire and you think of a really pulpy premise, like vampire motorcycle gang, you can think of a pretty serious, effective, gritty horror movie that is that, you know, like why not? Like Lost Boys is almost that, and it's always comedy. Like,
but that's not gritty. I mean, when you said that,
it's not a comedy. But you could. I don't think it. Maybe nobody's done it, but like kitschy. Like you could do it without being too kitschy if you wanted to. Like you know, like same thing with zombies. Like in like Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, they're in this mall and it's satirical, but it's not kitschy. Yeah. You know, like it's, you know, they're interacting with everyday culture in this way that it's not. But Lovecraftian monsters get kitschy as soon as you get near real life, very easily. And I think that is why, depending on your attitude toward it, like a lot of the Lovecraftian attempts fail, is because these psychological horrors, which are about anxieties of nameless dread, and then as soon as you're like, well, I was in the mall and then there was a tentacle, it's like, yeah, this doesn't work. Or at least you've shifted out of his register.
But and the thing is, Lovecraft
is more vulnerable. Well, go ahead.
Lovecraft in the text will call it nameless dread, but a lot of times you can name the dread. I mean, you know the dread that Lovecraft is writing about, that he's turning into the in-story nameless dread.
I agree, but I also feel like the subject of the story is often more the nameless dread than the thing that the dread ends up being. There's something, his monsters seem very vulnerable to being kitchified. Like every single one of his creatures seems to be, they all get illustrated, but they also seem to be like, they're better as just you trying in your mind to put those body parts together.
Yeah.
Like that's almost more, I mean, there are some great illustrators who have once in a while managed to pull it off, but like, you know, in Alien, there's all those parts of, like, there's that plasm that people get stuck in, or the landscape of the Giger landscape.
Yeah.
And you're like not sure what's a creature and what's the landscape. Yeah. That seems to be like the closest to the way the writing wants to be. You know, like you're just sticking, it has this feature and that feature and the other feature, and there's nameless dread. And then when you get to an actual thing, it seems like a little bit of a letdown, because it's really about the mind trying to grapple with the unknown. That's why they, you know, when you have the Cthulhu plushie effect happens so quickly.
I used to have the Cthulhu slivers. No, but what I find interesting, Lovecraft, part of his problem, but also what ends up making especially the later stories great, is that for him, the unknown that he's afraid of is other people. Yeah. That is part of it. And although what you're saying about the illustration making it difficult, the two best visual representations I've ever seen of Lovecraftian things were actually in movies. One, the German version of Color Out of Space. The movie's in black and white, except for the color. The color's in color, and it's like, okay, that effectively makes it Alien. It's like, okay, that was the way to do that. I haven't seen the Nicolas Cage version yet, so I don't know how they show the color. But having the rest of the movie black and white and the color be color, I thought was a really good hit. That was I don't know, early 2010s, maybe late 2020s. It's a very low budget, movie, and they did it perfectly. And the other thing was the Call of Cthulhu silent movie.
Is that in early 2000s?
Yeah, it might be. Total low budget amateur production, but there's a scene where Cthulhu's awakened and the crew is running away, through the city of Relaya trying to get back to their ship, and they do a forced perspective shot where a guy, falls into a pit or a chasm that's not supposed to be there and the way they shot it, and it was just, they constructed something in someone's backyard and did this forced perspective trick that when it happens, you're like, whoa, and it was all done like in camera practical effect. First time I saw it, it like broke my brain a little. It's like, oh, it's like the first time you see, you'll know the name of the artist, the one that like has the stairs that all loops into each other that shouldn't be possible.
MC Escher.
Yeah. It's like the first time you see that, it's like, what's going on here? And it's the same thing with this effect in the Call of Cthulhu silent movie. Someone falls into a hole that, the behind the scenes stuff, when you just get a little bit different angle, it's like, oh yeah, obviously that's how they did it, but they were able to line it up. So in the moment, it was just like, that's not right.
I wonder, in both cases, you're describing movies that have, like, to begin with, a distancing stylized element, like the black and white, like a modern,
yeah, they're both in black and white
silent movie, and then a black and white movie. But it's like, it's almost like if you depicted it with total realism, the bar is almost impossibly high. Whereas, like, almost the point of Lovecraft's is you're trying to see it through a screen. And when it's purely written, like a novel or like a short story, the screen is that you can't see anything, right? You're just trying to put the creature together in your head and hold it there as he describes it. So you're seeing it through this medium that makes visual realism, takes it off the table, and so you have to, and so like maybe like being like, this is a silent movie, it's already not real. Your brain is already like, this is a representation. So maybe getting to, and then this moment, almost like in both cases, there's a moment of peak realism through a stylized filter.
Yeah.
Like if the creature or the thing can be the most realistic thing in a medium that you've accepted as stylized, then maybe like that does, like, you've seen the reality finally, like you finally saw the truth.
Yeah, I imagine if someone tried to do like a big budget Call of Cthulhu today, there's no way to make Cthulhu to where it's going to be it's not going to have the effect it needs to have. I can't imagine that a big studio production would have anything other than a big CGI monster that's very detailed, looks like something out of the newer Godzilla movies. And I don't know how that would go over with like normal people that might see it, but like Lovecraft fans are going to go, oh. Whereas I think the silent movie, they were using a stop motion model, which again creates an uncanny valley effect, which I think is actually correct, or creates more of the correct impression for a creature like that.
Well, it's like, okay, if you read, I am of the opinion that like Dracula media is almost always better than the novel Dracula. Like, Bram Stoker created a cool monster, like a really interesting monster, interesting world building of that monster, and history blended in, as did all the villagers in the world that invented vampires. But the monster is very robust, whereas the style of the story, which is this epistolary letter between all these writers, is very weak. It's almost like Lovecraft without Lovecraft's style. That's what you can easily import. You can import the monster, but not his style of writing is so important to those stories, but it's also important to making those creatures.
The way he wrote was almost otherworldly. So
yeah, it's like, but also the point of view of the character was otherworldly. Like the character was a little removed. The character was like, they had this sort of, I'm slowly moving toward my point. His writing elevates it, so you're just thinking about a different thing than the physical interactions.
Yeah.
Like you don't come away from the stories thinking about the tentacle grabbing a person. That's the real monster. Like his style is the monster, you know, like not the monster.
Yeah. That reminds me, The Mist, the movie The Mist.
It's like the Stephen King.
Yeah. That one scene where they've escaped and they're going down the road, and then they witness this gigantic, to me, looked like an elephant kind of monster, just this huge thing. It's not a threat to them. It doesn't even notice them. But just the fact that this thing exists, that they're looking up as it's just going on its way. I think that was one of the more effective on-screen Lovecraftian type monsters, because it just doesn't notice the person. It's not an action scene. It's not a threat scene. It's just like, what the fuck exists?
Have you ever seen like a Jacques Cousteau or something where somebody really gets really close to a whale and it just kind of comes in past the camera and you can just see all the texture on the whale, and you're like, every single thing, like little scratch, is like something that happened to this thing that's like, they can be 150 years old. Like there's something about that which is like, that's kind of the point. Like a classic horror movie is, it's going to kill you, right? Like whatever it is coming after you. But it's more about like, the whale is ignorance, right? Like this is how ignorant you are. This is how much you don't know. It's just like coming up past you. That's the scary part. It's just like, well, if there's this, there's so much you don't get. There's so much that you're seeing the tip of an iceberg of not just your irrelevance, but you don't get really what's going on at all, you know?
Yeah. Well, that you're using that example as like triggering actual phobias in me, because I remember as a kid we took a field trip to the Museum of Natural History in New York, and they had I'm sure it wasn't a taxidermied specimen. I'm sure it was some sort of model, but they had like a full-sized blue whale.
Yeah, they still have it,
and that freaked me out so bad that it created a fear of all like the other stuffed animals they had in the place. That it's just, I mean, when I was in,
especially the ocean, because that's
no, because I went in Natural History Museum in Vienna in 2017, and there was like a whole floor that's just these stuffed animals, and oh God, I was like almost paralyzed. I had to like be led through someone holding my hand to go through these exhibits just because.
How old were you? It's in Vienna.
This is 7 years ago. So I was.
Someone had to drag you. You agreed to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's like I know this is completely irrational. These things are not going to do anything, but my skin was just like crawling, and like YouTube videos. It's like I can't watch anything with whales or anything with sharks. That's why shark movies are really effective. I mean, I remember going to see The Shallows in the theater. Oh, but it's definitely something. I mean, even seeing like the pictures of like divers, next to whale sharks, which are completely harmless. Just is I
mean, there's a relatively common fear. It's not of drowning exactly, but people who are just scared of vast biosystem of the ocean. Like they see the ocean where it's placid and they're freaked out by the thought of all that action, life, breeding, pollution happening under the surface. That's like
Google Ryan George Ocean and enjoy that skit. There's like a comedy skit that's all about that. Lovecraft's focus on humanity being unimportant and so many greater things that don't care about humanity. Is that Lovecraft putting his fears of insignificance in his stories the way he put his fears of so many other things in the stories? Or is that kind of like trolling the Christian audience?
I think if you assume a background of waspy 20th century-ness, then atheism is something that you have a lot more emotions about than maybe the modern atheist. Like, it doesn't have to be trolling. It just be like, well, okay, you're this guy. You've decided there's definitely no God. You are surrounded by people who, in daily life, use phrases like God-fearing. Even the politics of the country is still bound up with people being pious, et cetera, et cetera. But you're like, atheism isn't a casual blank. It isn't a tabula rasa. It's something, well, if you are not contemplating, Jesus dying on the cross, you are contemplating something scary. Like imagining that the universe is created by accident for the first time. The first time you imagine it, and then you realize how much we know about the universe and how much universe there is and how complicated things are. There's a vastness implied there, right? Like you look at a little starfish that's shaped like a star, and you're like, okay, no God, this was just invented by natural processes. You're like, whoa, natural processes are crazy. And I think being in the first wave of popular awareness of that creates feelings. Like I think in a lot of ways, like we're always in that about something. There's always something. Social progress is always pointing to something that like actually is immensely complicated that we've been ignoring because we have a traditional story about it. And when the story is ripped away, there's usually people who are talking about, oh God, didn't you realize that this is very complicated? And then your mind expands, and you could almost chart the history of like avant-garde fiction in terms of what was the Band-Aid that was just ripped off. Like right now people are like, oh shit, gender is made up, like, and that's creating avant-garde fiction. And people who are like writing these stories about the complexity of like, how do I fit in socially, like, and it was drugs at one point, but there's a Band-Aid that was being ripped off of just like, how big is the world of your ignorance if we have to take away this comforting fiction? And I think that it wasn't trolling; it was very earnest.
I've read the huge biography of Lovecraft, and I'm always reading these Lovecraft racism articles just to see if there's anything new in there. Is there anything I don't know? Is there anything that's worse than I figure? And he definitely was xenophobic. He definitely was racist. He definitely did express it in his writing, but he's living at a time that the KKK and Birth of a Nation, Lovecraft as I'm freaked out by what I see in the world. I do think it's different than if he had the white hood and was lynching people and writing these stories. I do think that makes a difference. He was reacting badly to the world around him. He wanted to be in his sheltered little world. He couldn't be. He reacted badly. And that created at first crude expressions and then later better expression, I think. Because again, Shadow over Innsmouth, I think most people consider that one of his great works. What is to become of any budding little Lovecrafts out there today in a time of where social norms in the past 10, 15 years have gone through some changes, and some people are dealing with it better than others. One thing Lovecraft had was the space in the time where nobody was freaking out about him at the time. And I'm just thinking I'm imagining the people that aren't getting the chance to develop. They don't have the space to develop into something else, because instead of developing their art, they're fighting the world who's telling them you're wrong.
I mean, I don't know if there's like this teeming mass of like people who are still openly racist in 2024 who you're like, but I could shepherd you into being a great weird fiction writer, a creative person. You have an obligation to the work, and as a citizen, you have an obligation to make sure people aren't causing unnecessary harm. Lovecraft was part of these amateur press associations, which are a really important part of like sci-fi culture, and like basically they lasted until the 70s, and they were part of the birth of D&D, where like one of the people who was like Jen Jaquez was describing this, and she said like you would get essentially a written magazine, what today you would call a blog. You would put it in your typewriter or mimeograph machine, copy it, all of it, then add your own stuff, then mail it out to the mailing list. Then everyone in the mailing list would get it, add to it, and then mail it. So it was this community, very literally, of people who were separated, who were talking to each other. Even Lovecraft still had to interact productively with his community, which he did do. You know, like he had these other, like I said, one of the story he did with Barlow is one of my favorites. Like Barlow was a gay guy who eventually went on to be an archaeologist who influenced William S. Burroughs, killed himself by suicide, but like was just like a guy. He passed on a different trajectory, but and one that might have freaked Lovecraft out, honestly. But they could interact with each other in a community in a productive way to help each other become artists. And the amateur press associations he was part of were about that. And like, there are other pulp authors that he interacted with who aren't like, the main thing I took away from this guy is how racist he was. And I don't know how well that's been interrogated. I don't fucking know. But the point is, like, at a certain point, even H.P. Lovecraft has to find a way to productively interact with other human beings. If that person the person who cannot productively in any way think from the other person's point of view enough to interact with a community on any level might have a real interesting blog. And that's it. You know, you won't have a book because no one will buy it, even on POD. No one will talk about it. You know, like at a certain level, and that's why it's a compelling subject, because everyone fucking has to do it. Everyone has to interact with other people. And so it's a compelling subject about how fucking hard it is to interact with other people. Mm-hmm. In the history of Western philosophy, like Bertrand Russell's take on romanticism in general, he's like, as a philosophic movement, it was basically just people complaining about having to live in a society. And he's like, it worked extremely well as art and terribly as philosophy. And he basically blames Hitler on romanticism. He basically says, like, Hitler was somebody taking a creative feeling, which is, oh, fuck other people, and turning into a political feeling. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we just had people like us as far as the eye could see? And I think that Bertrand Russell's nobody to sneeze at when it comes to talking about reality. And as Lovecraft points to, let's not get it twisted. He was an incredibly limited author. He is like the Bertie Wooster guy, like who wrote all the Jeeves stories. Wodehouse.
Well, he did one thing, but he did it well. I like saying Tolkien was limited because he only did fantasy. I mean,
well, I'm more of a literary fiction fan than you are. You know, but I do think that there's a value in somebody who can make art out of something a little bit more mundane than a monster from space, because they can speak to a few more things about the human condition. But I do think like he was fantastically limited in every sense of the word fantastically. Cronenberg or Romero, I think those guys are probably more well-rounded than Lovecraft was. Because even if they kept making the same movie over and over, they have to talk to people, they have to interact with actors, they have to get funding, like, but that's the tremendous power of his stories. Is like, doesn't it suck that we have to interact with humans? Like, everyone has to. And that's kind of why it's a subject that doesn't go away. It may be the most extreme example of, I mean, there's probably like Maldoror and some other like extreme like French surreal like decadent era stuff where or against nature by Houseman's, which is just about like not this color, that color. I'm not going out of, like extreme example of like art is going to be the world and everything else is just not on the table. The most extreme version of that succeeding, like pointing to something real enough that it actually succeeds.
Yeah, that's where I think Lovecraft does succeed. That even when we find his particular dislikes, distaste, there's still a core of this is a thing that bothers me, and so this is going to be the object of fear in this story.
Yeah.
And a lot of the horror I see it's like you could tell that either the author is really awful or the author has no actual connection to the subject they're writing about.
Well, they're like not scared of anything.
They're not scared of anything they're writing about.
Like when you were describing the aquarium, that's real to you. The penguins are not going to come to life and peck you to death at all.
Even like stuffed deer freak me out. I mean, it wasn't just
deer are freaky. There's because they have those sad eyes. Like stuffed deers are like classically like death. Like there's something very like freaky about their antlers and like that. That's a classic trope. I just thought of something at the end of Lost Boys when Jason Patrick stabs Kiefer Sutherland through the heart. Doesn't he stab him with antlers? They're like flying around, and he shoves him against the wall, and it's a bunch of
deadly night treatment to him. Yeah,
but the thing is, antlers aren't wood, so he didn't stake him. So Kiefer Sutherland's still.
No, hold on. Is it important though? Is it important what the stake is made out of, or just that something's through the heart?
Oh, it's got to be wood. Otherwise, you could just shoot with bullets. Like all those Marvel Dracula stories, they're like, we have special wooden bullets. Like, no, of course it fucking matters.
Yeah, that's Marvel Dracula. That's not.
But I mean, otherwise, you could just have a sword. I mean, come on. It has to be a wooden stake.
Yeah. Trying to think the Marvel Solomon Kane when he defeated Dracula. What was it, a wooden stake? I can't remember. Maybe it was. Yeah. But you take it out and they come back to life, so it's not even permanent death.
Well, you got to chop his head off and burn.
Yeah.
I'm 100% sure I learned all the official rules from Marvel. Like, it's in the official handbook to the Marvel Universe. Like, in order to kill a vampire, you have to. So until probably I was like in my 30s, it never occurred to me. Like, I would just be like, "Oh, those are the rules of a vampire." Like, you stab him through the heart. Blah, blah, blah. It didn't occur to me this was just like literally Marv Wolfman describing the steps of killing a vampire.
We're totally off topic now. I remember when I was collecting the older X-Men comics. In the 80s, became a fan of the X-Men, and I wanted to get all the back issues I could possibly afford. And I got to that issue or two where they fight Dracula, and I'm like, well, who's reading an X-Men comic to watch them fight Dracula? Well, my God.
Well,
everything. And then they even
was the opposite of Lovecraft. He was like, I will put everything in my comic book. Like there is absolutely no mood. They're going to fucking go to space. Now they're going to play disco. Now they're going to fight Dracula. Now they'll fight a leprechaun. All right, did we do it?
I guess we should end by, now that we've had the discussion, we should take the vote. Lovecraft's racism, yay or nay?
I'm going to say nay.
Yeah, I guess I would have to say nay, although the person that Lovecraft's racism seems to have hurt the most was Lovecraft himself, because it didn't seem like he went out and hurt other people. He just kept himself away from a lot of life because of it.
I would say a thing that I think is 100% true is when there's something really obviously wrong with somebody, that's never the only, like that's a canary in the coal mine of a lot of decisions they make around other people all day. All right. Thank you so much, James. Are there other things on the list that you are interested in, or do we have to have a whole new list of topics?
Maybe you pick the topic this time for
Okay.
next time, and then I'll have to figure out what I actually know about it.
Okay.
And,
all right.
And considering that what the topic is only tangentially going to be what we talk about, apparently, this shouldn't be a problem.
All right. I'll see you later.
Okay.